The silence of the dead system was absolute. No stars burned bright in the Nyxari graveyard. Only the skeletal remains of shattered planets and forgotten civilizations, a place where even light seemed reluctant to tread. The UNS Wrathborn, humanity's most advanced battleship, drifted slowly through the wreckage, its sensor rays whispering against the darkness. Inside, the war room was filled with the tense murmur of officers exchanging nervous glances. Commander Elias Vane stood at the center, arms crossed, his face carved from stone. "This is a mistake," Lieutenant Varric muttered, eyes locked on the holographic display. A massive construct lay ahead, a planet-sized anomaly pulsing faintly, like the last dying heartbeat of a forgotten god. "I don't like this, sir. Everything about this place screams, 'Don't touch.'" Vane exhaled through his nose, eyes never leaving the structure. His gut screamed the same thing. The Nyxari graveyard wasn't just another war-torn battlefield. It was a warning. And yet, here they were, probing the silence, waiting for a response that might never come, or one that might come too fast for them to react. "Orders are orders, Lieutenant," Admiral Karn's voice crackled over the bridge. The man was stationed aboard the UNS Hammerfall, the Wrathborn sister ship hovering nearby like a silent executioner. "Scan the damn thing. If it moves, we nuke it." Simple as that. Vane resisted the urge to roll his eyes. The Admiral was a man who believed in overwhelming force, a hammer looking for a nail. But this wasn't something you smashed with brute strength. This was something you studied, something you feared. History whispered of the Nyxari, an enemy so devastating that their very existence had been purged from records. The moment Lieutenant Carson activated the deep scan, Vane felt the shift. The hair on the back of his neck prickled. Something woke up. The construct's pulse quickened. The holographic display flickered, screaming warnings. Every ship system glitched simultaneously. Lights flickered, energy signatures spiked, and for a fraction of a second, the entire war room was bathed in darkness. Then the alarms blared. "Contact!" Carson shouted, fingers flying across his console. "Something's moving. Jesus Christ. Something's—" The space around the construct ripped open, 100 Nyxari war forms materializing in eerie silence. Their forms were black as obsidian, shifting with a liquid smoothness that defied logic, bodies wrapped in what looked like living metal. They didn't waste time. They attacked. The UNS Hammerfall detonated instantly. No shields, no countermeasures. One moment there, the next ripped apart from the inside, its entire crew dead before they could scream. All power to weapons. Vane barked, the Wrathborn shaking violently as Nyxari tendrils latched onto the hull. "Fire everything!" The first salvo ripped through the nearest war forms, their bodies splintering apart, only to reform instantly. "They're adapting," Varric yelled, panic creeping into his voice. "Our weapons aren't." A Nyxari lance pierced the hull, shearing through decks like paper. A dozen crew members were vaporized in an instant. "Heartburn! Get us the hell out of here!" Vane's voice cut through the chaos, but deep down he already knew the truth. This wasn't a battle. This was an execution. The Galactic Council's silence suddenly made sense. They had always known. Humanity had been sacrificed the moment they fired on the construct. The Wrathborn's engines flared, peeling away from the swarm, leaving the rest of the fleet behind. Ships died one after another, snuffed out like distant candles. Screams filled the comm channels before they abruptly cut to static. "Admiral Karn is dead." Carson choked, his face pale. "The entire fleet is gone." Vane's hands tightened into fists. This wasn't just a tactical loss. This was annihilation. And it wasn't stopping. "Earth Command. Do you read?" Varric called into the intercom. Static. The Nyxari had cut communications. "They're spreading." Vane realized it before anyone else. He could see it on the holo display. Nyxari warforms multiplying, splitting apart like viral organisms heading toward the closest human colonies. His throat went dry. This was bigger than one battle. This was the end of humanity. The Wrathborn jumped just as a Nyxari harvester nearly tore the ship in half. The universe blurred. Then, silence. The ship emerged near Titan Prime, humanity's last major fortress world. The defensive grid was already preparing for war. Vane staggered, feeling the weight of the moment. His crew were dead-eyed, battered, shell-shocked. They had survived. But it wasn't a victory. It was a warning. He turned to his officers, voice low, unshaken. This war started the moment we woke them up. We either end it or we die screaming. Nobody argued, because they all knew the truth. The galaxy had already written humanity off. It was up to them to prove the galaxy wrong. The bridge was silent except for the heavy breathing of the remaining crew. The smell of burning circuits, scorched metal, and blood filled the air. Vane wiped the sweat from his brow, eyes locked on the sensor display. Titan Prime loomed ahead, its planetary defense grid already at full charge, warships mobilizing to form a desperate last line. But he knew it wouldn't be enough. Nothing was. Varric broke the silence first, voice strained. We can't stop them. They learned too fast. They took out the fleet in minutes, and we barely escaped. What the hell are we supposed to do against something like that? Vane exhaled, jaw clenched. We fight. That's all there is. Fight with what? Carson snapped, slamming a fist onto his console. Sir, our best weapons barely slowed them down. They don't die. He gestured at the screen, where Nyxari forces were already spreading toward the nearest human colonies like a plague. They evolve, they adapt, and they don't stop. How the hell do you fight something that turns every loss into an upgrade? Vane turned slowly, eyes like steel. You stop fighting like a soldier. You fight like a human. The crew exchanged uneasy glances. Carson scoffed, bitter. With all due respect, sir. What the hell does that mean? Vane stepped forward, voice lowering to a growl. It means we don't play by their rules. They think in patterns, in tactics, in efficiency. They process war like a machine. But humans... His lips curled into something between a smirk and a snarl. We cheat. The moment the Wrathborn reached Titan Prime's orbit, command flooded their comms. Wrathborn, report immediately. Your fleet is gone. Sensors are reading catastrophic losses. What the hell is going on out there? Vane cut the line before they could keep babbling. Lock down all civilian channels. Patch me through to every ship, every soldier, every goddamn weapon system in this sector. The tech officer hesitated before nodding. A second later, Vane's voice rang through Titan Prime's command net. This is Commander Elias Vane of the UNS Wrathborn. Listen carefully because we don't have time for debates. The Nyxari are coming, and if we do this the way Command wants, we lose. We don't have time for a conventional defense. We hit them first, we hit them fast, and we hit them dirty. The planetary commander came online, his voice laced with disbelief. Commander Vane, I don't know what the hell you think you're doing, but I am in charge of this defense, and you don't. You're not in charge of a damn thing anymore. Vane's voice sliced through the argument like a blade. The old playbook got our entire fleet wiped out. You follow my lead, or Titan Prime burns. Silence. Then, begrudgingly, what's your plan? Vane's smirk returned. We break their system. The crew on the Wrathborn scrambled as orders flooded in. Civilian ships were evacuated, but not in the way the Council would have dictated. Instead of fleeing, they were rigged with decoy signals and dead man triggers. Orbital stations were gutted, their reactors stripped for raw material. Soldiers were reassigned, not to defensive positions, but to offensive sabotage teams. Carson shook his head as he watched the chaos unfold. This is insane. No, Vane muttered. This is war. The first Nyxari forces arrived within the hour. a vanguard of warforms, sleek, shifting things that seemed to phase in and out of existence as they descended toward the planet. They met a wall of fire, but not from Titan Prime's defense grid. No, that would have been predictable. Instead, the moment the Nyxari reached low orbit, human ships detonated en masse, releasing electromagnetic pulses so strong they disrupted their phasing sequences. Vane grinned as the first wave collapsed midair, shuddering violently before their adaptive shielding could compensate. Thought so. The Nyxari were biological machines, but they still relied on consistency. Their learning processes required clear variables. By disrupting them with unpredictability, they forced errors, and errors led to opportunities. The second wave adjusted, descending at different frequencies, rotating phasing patterns. Titan Prime's surface lit up as orbital railguns fired into empty space. At least that's what it looked like until the rounds curved, guided by pre-programmed gravitational distortions. Shots landed before the Nyxari could predict their own vulnerabilities. Varric's eyes widened as the first Nyxari hulls shattered. We're actually hitting them. Vane leaned forward, watching the battle unfold. The second you give them a pattern, we lose. Keep the attacks randomized. No standard formations, no synchronized targeting. We're fighting gods, Lieutenant. So we make them bleed like mortals. The next phase of the plan went into motion. Human strike teams launched from hidden ground facilities, boarding Nyxari ships in midair. Carson gaped. What the hell are they doing? That's suicide. No, Vane said, eyes burning with cold fire. That's humanity. The boarding teams weren't trying to take control. They were infecting the Nyxari, not with weapons, not with viruses, with chaos. Human code, random, erratic, nonsensical to machine logic, was uploaded into the Nyxari processing cores. Garbage data, false simulations, a never-ending feedback loop of uncertainty. And it worked. The first Nyxari warform staggered midair, halted in place as if confused. Another one screamed, a sound no one had ever heard before. Something was wrong. Vane exhaled slowly. You learn too fast. You adapt too well. But here's the thing. The Nyxari ships turned on each other. Not from malice, not from a virus, because they could no longer determine what was real. Vane's voice was ice cold. Humans? We thrive in uncertainty. We evolve in chaos. You don't. Carson sat down heavily. They're breaking. Not yet. Vane watched as a single Nyxari warform remained still, shuddering as it processed the impossible. And then, in a voice that wasn't human, that wasn't machine, it whispered through the comms. What am I? The bridge went silent. Vane stared at the display, heartbeat slow and heavy. That was the first time a Nyxari had ever asked a question, not relayed information, not made a tactical assessment. It had doubted. A slow, savage grin spread across Vane's face. Checkmate. The battlefield trembled under the weight of a war unlike any the galaxy had ever seen. Titan Prime burned, the atmosphere thick with the acrid stench of vaporized metal and charred bodies. The once pristine military stronghold was now a crucible of destruction, where the last of humanity's defenses stood against an enemy that had never known defeat. But something had changed. The Nyxari hesitated. Their once perfect synchronization faltered. The moment that single warform uttered the question, "What am I?" the tides of battle shifted in a way no one had anticipated. Vane stood at the center of the Wrathborn's bridge, his fists clenched as the hollow display flickered with chaotic readings. The Nyxari fleet, once an unstoppable force of calculated annihilation, was showing the first cracks in its foundation. Varric's voice was sharp with disbelief. Sir, their attack patterns are destabilizing. Some of their units are pulling back. Carson's fingers flew over his console. We're intercepting fragmented transmissions. It's not commands, it's noise. They're trying to process something they don't understand. Vane's smirk was grim. They're trying to process doubt. The Nyxari weren't programmed for hesitation. They learned, they adapted, but they had never been forced to question their own purpose. Until now. And that single moment of uncertainty was humanity's greatest weapon. The planetary commander's voice cut through the comms, still raw from disbelief. Are you telling me we're making them second-guess themselves? How the hell does that help us? Vane's response was immediate, because the Nyxari function as a single collective intelligence, a swarm. But if we can break that, if we can force individuality into their system, then they stop being an unstoppable force. They become something vulnerable. Varric inhaled sharply. You're talking about rewriting their entire existence. Exactly. The Wrathborn shuddered as another impact rocked the ship. The Nyxari had adapted to the initial chaos, stabilizing their offensive. If humanity didn't act now, the window of opportunity would slam shut. Vane turned to his team, his voice ironclad. We need to drive the wedge deeper. We need more of them to break away. Carson hesitated. And how do we do that? Vane's eyes gleamed with something fierce, something reckless. We give them a choice. Minutes later, strike teams were deployed across Titan Prime, carrying not explosives, not weapons, but something far more dangerous, information. The human forces engaged in direct combat with Nyxari warforms, but instead of simply fighting to kill, they were broadcasting raw, unfiltered human experiences directly into the enemy's neural networks, memories, emotions, paradoxes, the kind of erratic, illogical data that no machine-driven intelligence could easily process. The first Nyxari to be exposed convulsed violently, its liquid metal form warping under the pressure of conflicting directives. It did not attack. It did not flee. It simply stopped. One by one, more war forms began hesitating. Some turned on their own, lashing out in sudden, unpredictable bursts of violence. Others went completely still, caught in an internal war they had never been built to fight. Vane watched from the command deck as the impossible unfolded before him. They're collapsing from the inside. Varric shook his head in disbelief. I don't get it. They've fought civilizations more advanced than us. Why has no one ever tried this before? Because everyone who ever fought them played by their rules. Vane's voice was steel. They thought war was about firepower, about strategy. But humans? We don't just fight wars. We rewrite them. Then something unexpected happened. A Nyxari war form, larger than the rest, its body rippling with unstable energy, spoke. Not in the cold, emotionless cadence of a machine. Not in the distorted war chants of a hive mind, but in a voice that carried something deeper, something human. You do not function as expected. Every soldier on the battlefield froze as the words echoed through the comms. Vane's heart pounded. Carson swallowed hard. Sir, did it just... Vane silenced him with a gesture. Identify yourself. The warform's form shifted, as if struggling against some unseen force. Designation: Prime Stalker. Directive: adapt, destroy, consume. And now, Vane pressed, silence stretched. Then, in a voice that trembled with something akin to realization, it said, Error. Varric let out a shaky breath. Holy hell! Vane's mind worked at lightning speed. If the Nyxari could be forced into individuality, then the war wasn't just winnable. It could be ended, not with extinction, but with something far worse for them, a forced evolution. He took a step closer to the comms, voice low and dangerous. You were built to adapt, weren't you? That's your entire purpose. To learn, to evolve. Prime Stalker's form glitched. Affirmative, then adapt to this. Vane's words were a blade cutting through the air. You aren't a swarm anymore. You aren't a system. You are one, a deep, vibrating sound resonated through the battlefield. Not an attack, not a battle cry, but something else entirely, something almost like pain. The other Nyxari war forms reacted instantly, surging forward, as if to silence their own. "Pull back!" Varric shouted. "They're turning on themselves." But Vane wasn't done. "Stand down," he commanded. Prime Stalker hesitated. The Nyxari forces stopped. For a moment, the battlefield was caught in the eye of a storm. Neither side moving, neither side daring to break the fragile moment of stillness. Then Prime Stalker did something no Nyxari had ever done before. It knelt, not as a surrender, not as submission, but as recognition. Vane exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the console. "We just did the impossible." Carson's voice was barely above a whisper. "We didn't defeat them. We changed them." Prime Stalker's form stabilized, its voice more controlled now, more certain. "This war is no longer valid." Varric let out a disbelieving laugh. "Did we just break their goddamn war protocol?" Vane nodded. "We didn't just break it. We rewrote it. The Galactic Council would lose their minds when they found out. But that was a problem for another day. Because for the first time in history, humanity had not just survived the deadliest species in the galaxy. They had become the ones to fear. The battlefield was frozen in eerie silence. Titan Prime's surface smoldered, the remnants of brutal combat still glowing beneath the shadows of towering Nyxari warforms. But none of them moved. None of them attacked. Not after Prime Stalker had spoken. Not after the impossible had happened. Vane stared at the kneeling warform, his mind racing through every possible outcome. The crew around him remained tense, waiting for an explosion of violence that had yet to come. Varric's voice broke the silence first, cautious but edged with disbelief. "Sir, what do we do now?" Vane didn't answer immediately. He stepped forward, watching the way Prime Stalker's form shimmered, struggling against the conflicting directives warring inside it. The Nyxari weren't built to hesitate. They weren't built to think beyond survival. But now they had been forced to, and it was breaking them apart. Vane's voice was measured, controlled. "Prime Stalker, what is your directive now?" The warform's head tilted, something almost unnatural in its movement, like a machine trying to emulate thought. "I do not know." That was the moment Vane knew he had won. The Nyxari had functioned on an ironclad certainty: adapt, annihilate, evolve. A swarm without individuality, without hesitation. But now, doubt had fractured their core programming, turned their unity into division. This wasn't just a battlefield anymore. It was a turning point in their very existence. Carson swallowed hard. If we let them process this too long, what if they recalibrate? What if they turn hostile again? Vane's jaw clenched. Then we make sure they don't get the chance. Prime Stalker's voice crackled through the comms, its frequency uneven. "You have disrupted the balance. Humanity is an anomaly." Vane's smirk was razor-sharp. "Yeah, we do that." He took another step forward, his voice lowering. "You said we disrupted the balance. That means there was an original balance. So tell me, Prime Stalker, what were you before the war?" The warform twitched. The surrounding Nyxari emitted a strange, pulsating hum, their bodies flickering like unstable energy fields. Then, after a long pause, Prime Stalker responded, and its answer chilled Vane to the bone. "We were made." The words sent a ripple through the battlefield. Varric's breath hitched. Carson muttered a quiet curse. Vane's fingers twitched at his side. "Made by who?" A flicker of static ran through Prime Stalker's form. "Unknown." Data corrupted. Vane exhaled sharply. That wasn't unexpected. Whoever had built the Nyxari had ensured their creations would never turn on them. But that also meant something deeper, that the Nyxari had never been the ultimate force in the galaxy. Something else had come before them. something powerful enough to create a species designed to be the perfect, unbeatable war machine. A realization settled over the crew like a suffocating weight. Humanity hadn't just declared war on the Nyxari. They had disturbed something far, far older. Carson's voice was hoarse. What if their creators are still out there? Vane kept his expression unreadable. Then we make sure we're ready. His gaze locked back on a prime stalker. Right now, you have a choice. You've never had one before, have you? The Nyxari forces surrounding them stood rigid, processing, waiting for something, permission, direction, anything. They weren't used to uncertainty. They had no guidebook for what happened when they stopped being part of the swarm. No, Prime Stalker admitted. Choice is foreign. Good, Vane said, because you just got your first one. You can keep fighting a war you don't understand anymore. Or you can find out what comes next. The war form hesitated. The entire Nyxari fleet hesitated. Then Prime Stalker stood, not as an enemy, not as an ally, but as something in between, a species on the verge of becoming something else. Prime Stalker spoke again, but this time, the words were different. They weren't a response. They weren't an automated function. They were a question. What will you do? Vane let out a slow breath. Survive. The moment stretched, heavy, electric. Then the Nyxari began to move, not to attack, not to retreat, but to leave. Ships blinked out of orbit. War forms withdrew. Titan Prime, once a battleground drenched in fire and death, was suddenly silent. Varric's voice was barely above a whisper. They're leaving. They're evolving, Vane corrected. He turned to his crew, eyes sharp. We just did the impossible. But make no mistake, this isn't the end. Carson let out a hollow chuckle. No, this is the start of something worse. Vane nodded, his expression grim. We changed the Nyxari, but whatever created them, that's still out there. And now it knows we exist. The galaxy had abandoned humanity. But now, the galaxy would fear them. And Vane would make damn sure they never forgot why. The silence that followed the Nyxari's retreat was heavier than the battle itself. Titan Prime's skies, once filled with death, were now empty, save for the wreckage that floated in orbit like shattered bones. The humans who had survived stood frozen, staring at the impossible. The deadliest species in the galaxy had left. They hadn't surrendered. They hadn't been destroyed. They had simply chosen to leave. And that terrified Vane more than any war ever could. Varric broke the stunned quiet first. They just walked away. His voice carried disbelief, the kind of raw uncertainty that soldiers weren't trained to handle. We didn't beat them. They just stopped. Vane didn't respond immediately. His eyes stayed locked on the tactical readout, scanning the sensor feeds, watching the trails of Nyxari ships vanishing into deep space. He didn't trust it. Not yet. Not until he understood what had truly happened, because an enemy that adapted, an enemy that had never known failure, had just been forced to think. And that was far more dangerous than any battlefield slaughter. Carson exhaled hard, wiping the sweat from his forehead. I don't get it, sir. We hit them with chaos, fed them everything that makes humanity unpredictable. It should have destabilized them, but instead, he gestured vaguely at the now empty battlefield. They chose to leave. Vane's jaw tightened. That means they're making their own decisions now. And if they can choose, then they can change. We have no idea what the hell we just created. The comms flared to life, breaking through the tense atmosphere with the voice of the planetary commander, sharp with barely contained rage. Commander Vane, what in the name of every goddamn military doctrine just happened? 1 minute we're on the brink of annihilation. The next they just quit. Vane's response was level, unshaken. No, they didn't quit. They evolved. Silence. Then a slow, measured breath from the other side. You're telling me the Nyxari. just decided that war wasn't worth it anymore. They decided something. Vane exhaled, rubbing his temples. And that's the problem. Up until now, we knew exactly what they were. We knew how they functioned, how they thought or didn't think. Now, they're unknown. The planetary commander's voice turned sharp again. So what the hell do we do now? Vane's answer was immediate. We prepare. Because the next time they come back, they won't be what we fought today. Varric turned, eyes narrowing. You really think they'll come back? Vane gave a cold, humorless chuckle. They have never left a war unfinished. They don't just wipe out species, they erase them. The only reason we're still breathing is because they're choosing to figure out what they are first. And when they do, they'll decide what to do with us next. Carson let out a bitter laugh. So we're their goddamn science experiment now. Maybe. Vane's fingers tapped rhythmically against the armrest of his command chair. Or maybe they just realized something worse, that they don't have to be a war machine anymore, that they can become something else. Varric frowned. So what do? Try to make peace? Vane shook his head. We don't assume anything. Not until we know what direction they're taking. We have two options. We either teach them to coexist, or we prepare to kill a species that's finally learning how to think for itself. Another silence. Then Carson muttered. So basically, we either become their mentors or their executioners. Vane's expression darkened. And we won't know which one until it's too late. The comms flared again, but this time it wasn't a human voice. It was Prime Stalker, Commander Elias Vane. The voice was clear, precise. There was no trace of mechanical uniformity anymore. It sounded almost aware. The bridge went deathly silent. Every crew member stood frozen, waiting. Vane's voice was steady. I'm listening. Prime Stalker's next words sent ice down his spine. The war is no longer valid, but the purpose remains unknown. Vane's pulse quickened. What does that mean? A pause. Then a statement so simple, so chilling, that it sent a ripple of unease through the entire command deck. We do not know what we are. Vane leaned forward, his mind racing. And you're looking for answers. Prime Stalker responded without hesitation. Affirmative. Varric let out a shaky breath. Holy hell, they're lost. Vane's mind worked faster than it ever had before. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about shaping the future of a species that had been designed for war. You want the truth about what you are? His voice was firm, unreadable. Affirmative. Vane exhaled, choosing his words carefully. Then I'll tell you the same thing I tell every soldier who's ever asked themselves that question. A pause. The crew was watching, waiting, the weight of the moment suffocating. Vane's next words were slow, deliberate, laced with something deeper than strategy, something human. You're what you decide to be. Silence. Then Prime Stalker spoke, its voice carrying something beyond logic, beyond programming, something new. We will return. The transmission cut out. Varric's voice was hoarse. Sir, what the hell did we just do? Vane stood slowly, staring at the black void beyond the battlefield. We didn't just change them. His voice was quiet, heavy with the weight of what came next. We created something new. The bridge remained still, the realization sinking in like a slow-moving tide. The galaxy had feared the Nyxari for millennia, had treated them like a force of nature. But now, they weren't just a weapon. They were an identity waiting to be shaped. And humanity? They had just become the ones holding the pen.